Welcome. For those who don't know me, my name is Sean Vito. I serve on the Adult Education Commission and schedule this Adult Education time. One of the things I keep telling people is our very best resource are people in the pews next to us. And I was really fortunate this year to meet Cynthia Brunson-Swigert, who is new to the congregation, but not new to Minnesota. She was raised in Ascension, Stillwater, at that parish, and she was sponsored for ordination from there. She worked in interfaith relations in New York City and served parishes in the diocese of Western New York and Ohio, and then most recently Pittsburgh, from where she took early retirement. So she has been coming to the cathedral since December, as she has moved back to Minnesota to be with theology. So we're really excited to have Cynthia here and the Rabbi Marcia Zimmerman. So Cynthia will speak first, and then the rabbi will speak after. So I'll let Cynthia introduce the rabbi. So really good program today. Cynthia? I introduce the rabbi? I'll introduce the rabbi. So you can see me again, that's fine.
Okay. All I would like to do is spend a couple of minutes reminding us in an abbreviated form of the way that St. Luke teaches us. Because I think that's very important, and it's a little bit of setting the stage for the rabbi's presentation. And I would just like to say, of course, I saw what I think was the first reminder of the fact that Pentecost is coming up. I saw it in the wrapper of the reminder, which is typical in any congregation to wear red on that day. So I hope you're all thinking about what you might wear. Hopefully it won't be red flannel. But of course that's to, in our view, commemorate the descent of the Holy Spirit. Luke has this wonderful, vivid depiction of the flames on the disciples' heads and all of that. But I would just like to point out that whatever he may be utilizing in his sources that are historical, Luke is an evangelist. What we have in Luke is theological proclamation that Luke feels is very important to ground or root in, not necessarily history in that Sean walked in here 10 minutes ago, but the history of the people of God. And so Luke takes us throughout his gospel from the very first opening chapters. And Luke is sometimes called a physician. He's a poet. The Gospel of Luke has even been called a novel for the Gentiles. Because again and again and again, through his wonderful writing, he really is trying to not be the first person to talk to the early Christian community about Jesus, but to remind them and confirm the stories that they have heard, thus add a little bit more. But when we think of the stories we've heard this year of Mary and the Magnificat, Elizabeth and Zechariah, Luke drapes many of his characters in Hebrew scripture imagery. He doesn't draw straight lines and say, Elizabeth and Zechariah reminded me of Abraham and Sarah, but he suggests he wants people to see that he is grounding the story of Jesus in the biblical story. And he goes back to that again and again and again. Luke is the only one that has Jesus as a tween being taken to the temple. He's the story of the Feast of the Presentation, when Jesus as a baby is brought to the temple. We have the wonderful story of the prodigal son during Lent. And there is this younger brother, elder brother tension, but I always want to remind people of what Father says to the elder brother. He's kind of unhappy about the younger brother coming in. He says, but you are with me always, and all that I have is yours. So again, reminding people where Christians and Jews stand. Or not where they stand, but where they are in the great family of God. And so that's enough for me, except that I want to say that I don't think that Luke includes events accidentally. And what we call Pentecost and put what we'll call Shavuot. Shavuot is an event in history. But again, Luke finds it important to have this great manifestation of the pouring out of the Spirit on the disciples, linked to a particular historical and theological event as well. And I think just to keep our hearts and our minds and ears open to, again, the suggestion that Luke thought it was important for the early Christian community to understand that the spread of the church and the life of the Christian community post-Jesus was tied in a very important way to that event. And what did that mean? And I'm not drawing any straight lines either, because I just do be suggestive and us to hear what the rabbi has to say, and let it leave us in understanding.
Great, thank you. Just a bit of introduction of who I am. I'm Rabbi Marcia Zimmerman. I'm the senior rabbi at Temple Israel. Down the street, we're neighbors. We've had a lot of connection and relationship over the years between St. Mark's and, of course, Temple, through many of the priests who have been here, have been close friends, and so it's lovely to be back and to be a part of the congregation. So the first thing I want to say is Luke sounds like a Jew to me. He started out as a Jew.
And they say that he was a Gentile.
He was a Gentile. You know, and
He was a doctor, he had to be a Jew.
Well, he was smart, and he got the Jewish teachings, whether he was or not. So the idea here is that, you know, I think it was Abraham Joshua Heschel or Martin Buber who said all life is interpretation. And that's really what we're talking about here. It sounds like Luke is interpreting the same thing that the rabbis were interpreting at the time, and the emergence of change. So part of me wants to kind of begin with a little bit of Judaism 101 and just sort of then move into the idea of the reality of what we do between Passover and Shavuot, which is Pentecost. Okay, so that is kind of the beginning of things. The first thing I want to do is to show you where Judaism and Christianity kind of broke. Jesus was born Jewish, died as a Jew. Thought he was creating something new. He wanted to interpret Judaism in a new way. He wanted to reform Judaism. And what happened afterwards is a lot of what we're living with today, the letters of Paul and all of the Gospels and all of that. So just that is what we understand, or maybe it's my interpretation of history. And if you have a different one, that's great. That should be yours. But I think that what's important is that for Jews, Jesus lived, died as a Jew, who was a person in the time of great change and tumult, as we say. Once the Roman Empire came into Jerusalem, it was the beginning of a major transition in Judaism, as well as the creation of what today is Christianity. And so that is the period of time that is so complicated. And as Jews, we still live with. I just went to a lecture in Israel, and that was the lecture. The lecture is we're still living with the destruction of the temple in 17 CE, and that is what we live with today. And that is Jesus' time, the destruction of the temple, the Roman Empire, the Roman occupation, and that is really what we continue to live with. So let me just quickly go through kind of what we're talking about when we talk about Luke, and when we're talking about those things really quickly, so it's going to be so basic. So the first thing from a historic perspective is the Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses, okay? And so what we're going to talk about today between Passover and Shavuot is in here. It's in Torah, 5 books of Moses, okay? On top of that, we have what's called Nevi'im, which is the prophets. the prophetic text, prophets, I forgot the name of it. And that
Did
is,
you use a black pen?
oh, I
Can't
am, but
see that.
it's a thin pen, isn't it? It's not as thick as it could be. Let me see. What do you think? You know what? That doesn't work any better. They're all pointy. You think this is going to be
See
better?
if I can find
All right, it's a, oh, there we go. Is that better?
Good, thank you.
Is that better?
Yeah. Nitty-gritty. So that, and my handwriting is atrocious, so I have to apologize. So that's Torah, the 5 books of Moses. Okay, so that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's what this first section is. Nevi'im is the prophets. It's the second section. The third section is called, these are Hebrew words here, Ketuvim, which means writings. Those are the Psalms, that's Proverbs, that's the book of Esther, it's all the Megillot, so Lamentations, all of that. These 3 things together are what we call the Bible, okay? And I'm going to tell you the difference between what you pick up and what I pick up, okay? But what we really call the Bible in Judaism is we take the first letters of these 3 sections, and a Jewish word for Bible is Tanakh, okay? Tanakh is the acronym, right, for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. It takes the first letters, Tanakh, okay? We don't use the word Old Testament, right, because we don't believe that there's a New Testament. I totally respect and understand how you all believe that. That's not our sacred text, okay? So that's the difference. That's one of the major differences. The other difference is that these 3 sections, as we open up a book at Temple Israel, are based on what's called the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is the Hebrew text, okay? What you pick up in the St. James and the Word is from the Septuagint text, which is a text that was translated into Greek and then translated into Hebrew. The Masoretic text and the Septuagint text were codified at different times. And so they have the same books in them, they're in a different order. And if all life is interpretation, the Greek interpretation of the Hebrew is going to produce a different translation in English potentially. Okay? So, just for one example, the book of Isaiah is going to be very important in the Septuagint text if there's this concept of what we're going to come to in the creation of Jesus. So one word, let's just look at one word. That's why they're biblical scholars, and they can make a whole thing out of it. One word makes the difference between you and me. Bitulah. Bitulah means young woman. It can also mean virgin. It doesn't necessarily mean virgin every time. There you go. Major difference. It's amazing, okay? One word can make the distinction between Christianity and Judaism. And it both can be true, even if they contradict. Jews are great at contradictions, loving to live in those contradictions, and believing that actually God lives in those contradictions, not in the certainty. Okay, so that is really the piece that I think is crucial. So here we have, so when you say Old Testament, you're not talking about this. You're talking about the Septuagint text, not the Masoretic text. And that's what we use in Judaism. Okay? So it's a... Then what happens is there's 2 major historic events that happen. In 586 BCE, the first temple in Jerusalem is destroyed. 50 years later, it is rebuilt. Oh, in that 586, destroyed, the Jews are taken to Babylon. Babylon is Iran, Iraq area. They are displaced. The first diaspora of the Jewish world. Diaspora means to be dispersed. We are now totally diaspora. I am a diaspora Jew. I don't live in Israel. I I live in the United States. I am a diaspora Jew. The diaspora of the Babylonian diaspora was the first. We got there later, right? We came from Egypt. I guess you could say Egypt was a diaspora, but first diaspora Jew. First destruction of the temple. 70 CE. Now you see we use BCE, CE. Why? Exactly. Common year, not after death. After death is related to Jesus. AD is related to Jesus. We use BCE and CE because of that. Okay? So, 70 CE, second temple destroyed. This is the time of Jesus. Of course, building up to it, he was pretty much gone by then, right? He died in 60.
Pretty much gone.
Pretty much gone. Depending on when you think he was born. That's the whole question, right? So, in his 30s he died, but he died in like 66.
39, 30.
Earlier? 30?
Well, it's suggested
Yeah,
that he
yeah,
might
because
have
there's
been
a-
born before
So he was born.
BCE.
Okay.
So he would have been, like in the,
29 to 33
yeah,
CE.
yeah.
33.
29 to 33.
39 to 33, depending if you were born before 0 or what happened. Okay, good. Okay, so good. So good. I got my little bit of history up. So 70 CE, the second temple is destroyed, and that begins a whole new understanding. The time of Jesus, Roman occupation had been there. There were many people in the Galilee and throughout Israel who were beginning to say, things are changing. We need a new definition of what this is, knowing that things were not as easy to go into Jerusalem, to offer sacrifice, to have Passover, to do all those things. So here we have the beginning of major change. And what probably from 586 to 70 in all those years. And what happens here at Jewish history is that we have the creation of what we call rabbinic Judaism. We never had rabbis before 1st, 2nd century of the Common Era. We had priests. Okay? So, we don't use the word priests anymore. You do, Catholic Church does. But we have rabbis now. Mishnah has 1st through 3rd century material, probably 2nd century because it was codified. And then this has about 3rd through 5th century material. This is called the Gemara. Together, this is called Talmud. Talmud is basically the same period of time as the Gospels and the New Testament. So, we've got our oral tradition, you've got your New Testament, and that's where we split. Okay? Now, when we talked about Luke speaking as a Gentile and to Gentiles, right? What you have to understand is there were Jews, right? There were Jews who followed Jesus. And what they did is they went in, and for the most part, what I've had explained to me, I'll say it in the name of Father O'Connell, is that these Jesus followers were not trying to necessarily get other Jews. They were trying to get the Gentiles, the Goyim, the other people in that area to come over to Christianity. So that makes perfect sense in light of that, what Luke was doing. Luke had to give some theological lens so people could move over. Okay? That's all the history I'm going to give you on Judaism. But I just wanted you to know what's happening Jewishly, because what we do between Passover and Shavuot begins here in Torah and then is truly created in the Talmud. A little bit of information for you. Jesus never sat down at a Seder. He never sat down at the Seder that we have at Temple. Because the Seder we have is rabbinic Judaism. He didn't live that long. He was doing what was told we should do for Passover in the Torah. Okay? That's what the Last Supper was. You're supposed to bring a lamb and offer it, and you're supposed to eat the entire thing. If your family is not large enough to eat the entire thing, without breaking a bone, by the way, you cannot break a bone of the lamb. You have to eat the entire thing, including the organs. The inside? A delicacy, I guess. If your family is not big enough, you need to bring other families and other people around. That's the Last Supper. It's the offering, and Jesus had to bring other people around to eat the entire thing. That's what we're told to do in Torah. It's not the story that comes down necessarily, but that is what was happening. Okay? So we have all of that basic history. The next thing, that's a little bit of Judaism 101, before we get to the specific, is our cycle of the year. It comes from Torah. Okay? Cycle of the year comes from Torah. We are an agricultural people. It means that everything has a historic, agricultural, and spiritual meaning, every one of our holidays. But if it's based in agriculture, then we have to have the celebration in the right season, right? So, we have to add an extra month in our year every 3 or 4 years, and it just kind of is interesting how it all works out. It's not precise. I can't tell you every 4 years because it goes back and forth. That's why Ramadan, in the Muslim tradition, they also have a lunar calendar. We follow a lunar calendar. In a lunar calendar, we lose more days than just one, like we do in the Gregorian calendar or the solar calendar. So what happens is that we have to add a month to keep everything in its time, in its season. All right? So the Muslim tradition says, no, we don't need that leap month. And so Ramadan moves all around the year into different seasons, because that's what would have happened to Jews if we didn't compensate for the loss of time that happens in the lunar calendar. All right? So, the first month we have, all right? Oh, whoops. 6 months, okay. All right. I guess I haven't had coffee today. The first month of the lunar calendar in Judaism is Nisan. Nisan is the celebration of Passover. Okay? You should have a question. I'm going to give you the answer. The 7th month is the month of Tishrei. So this is fall. This is spring. This is summer. And this is winter. Okay. Tishrei is the celebration of Rosh Hashanah, the new year. What's wrong? And Yom Kippur and all the other ones, but this is the new year. What?
It's not number 1.
It's not number 1. Exactly. It's not number 1. What are we doing here? We're beginning a new year on the 7th month. Why don't we do it on the 1st month? Well, the rabbis had the answer. They said, no, there are really 4 new years. There's a new year of the trees that happens here in Shvat, which is the 11th month. There's a new year of the kings, which is Rosh Hashanah. There's the new year of the cattle, which comes in the month of Elul. And there's the new year of the months, which is Nisan. Okay? So here we have a new year, a beginning. We have, if you look at it from an agricultural or even from a shepherd's perspective, right? This is the new beginning of everything. We're starting to plant, we're starting to harvest, and things are happening all at the same time. We're planting while other things are harvesting, we're harvesting while other things are planting. It's this whole process in Judaism. So the first thing here is that we have this amazing amazing planting, celebration, new beginning, and it's the celebration of the Exodus from Egypt. Okay? That's the historic connection to the agricultural reality of beginning to plant in the spring, which brings a spiritual connection of liberation. Okay? God has redeemed us. That is a major play in Judaism. God is creator of the world, redeemer of us from slavery, and revealer. And that's going to happen in Shavuot, giving us the Torah at Mount Sinai. Those are the three major roles God plays in our lives according to Judaism. And two of the three are going to happen right now. Okay? So, God redeems us, takes us out of slavery into freedom. All right? We never make it to the promised land in the 5 books of Moses. We're just on the cusp. We've been on the cusp a few times. It took us 2 years. You can walk from Egypt to Israel in less than, really, maybe depending if you're going to Jerusalem, it might take you a few more days, but you can literally walk from Egypt to Israel in a matter of a day. It's not far. Physically, it's not far. Spiritually, it's huge. Right? We're taking slaves and we're saying, you're now going to be free people. We, as Jews, understand our physical freedom does not necessarily give us our spiritual freedom. 2 years after we left Egypt, we were on the cusp of the Promised Land. We were right there. We sent in a few scouts to see what it was all about. They came back with horror stories. 2 of those 12 scouts came back and said, you know, there's enemies there. They're big. But guess what? We're going to be okay. Everyone else said, oh, God, it's horrible. Don't go there. And the people listened to the 10 who said, don't go there. And so we stayed in the desert for another 38 years. So that the generation of the slaves would die out. Because slave mentality cannot be erased necessarily. Right? Physically free, we celebrated Nisan. Shavuot, 50 days later. So 50 days, sounds familiar. Becomes the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. What we call, in Hebrew, Matan Torah, giving. Okay? Matan Torah. So, liberation. What do we do in these 50 days? Well, we walked around a lot, right? That's how we got out of Egypt. All right? We were gone. We walked around a lot. We came to Mount Sinai, given the Torah. One time the Torah was given and the Jews created, or there weren't Jews yet. It was Israelites. At that point, Jews don't come till much later from the tribe of Judah. So Israelites. Israelites come together. They create a golden calf. Moses comes down and says, what's going on? Smashes the first set of tablets. He's to go back up for the second set of tablets. And finally, the Israelites adhere to it, and he comes back down, and then that. So it takes a while. Even at Mount Sinai, it takes a little while, right? So things happen. So what happens? These 50 days are counting, and we call it the counting of the Omer. The Omer is a barley sheaf. Remember I said there's some planting, there's some harvesting. Barley is the first thing that comes up. It's hardy. It doesn't need the summer and the sun and all of that like tomatoes do. Barley's pretty hardy, okay? We're talking about Israel. We're not talking about Minneapolis. So it's getting hotter in Israel, right? It's raining. It's raining through this time, and now it's starting to soak up, and you're not going to get rain now for a very long time in Israel. So the 50 days is called the counting of the Omer. We begin counting from the second day of Passover to the 50th day, which is Shavuot, which is the 6th of Sivan, the month of Sivan. Okay? That is Shavuot. So we count, we get to there, and we say, physically we were free. Now this is the beginning of our our spiritual freedom, receiving Torah. Torah, how many commandments do you think there are in the Torah? It's a trick question, so the one answer you don't want to say is 10. 613. There you go. We have 613 commandments in Judaism. Because we are a tradition of law. I love law. We are a tradition of law. It is what I rest on and depend on as a Jew. The basic distinction that happened in Christianity was the desire to put creed over deed. Perfect. It's a system, it's a philosophical and theological perspective. It's a lovely perspective. It's not my perspective. I have a very different one. I have deed that leads to creed. I do in order to believe. All right? Very different systems. Based on this, 613 commandments mean that what I put in my mouth, what I buy at the store, is a Jewish act. It means what fork I use is a Jewish act. That is Judaism. I'm not saying better, worse, whatever. The reason I always say I am a person who loves law, who loves that tradition, even as a Reformed Jew, is because so often the two communities have demonized the other, have held themselves up by saying we are not, right? And that is on some level ridiculous because especially the Episcopal Church and the Catholic Church, you have law, you have traditions, you have things. Nothing is pure as when you're trying to define yourself against another. So Judaism has love and creed and law. And so does Christianity. It's just where you put the emphasis, right? And I think that's really the place to begin because so often we like to begin on what we're not rather than what we have in common. And I'm one to agree that we have to also talk about what we in difference because that's exactly what keeps us who we are. That's the power of it. But to understand it, to understand where our narratives are similar and where our narratives are different. Okay? So that is a major difference between Judaism and Christianity. It really is. It's how we see the world. And that is the difference between Passover and Shavuot. So I got a lot done in a short period of time. So why don't I stop for a moment and see if there are questions, and let's just sort of see what happens, because I can continue to talk, but I'm afraid I'm throwing a lot of information at you, and I'd like to know if there's kind of questions or anything that you came with, even if it has nothing to do with anything I said, that you want to answer. So let's take a moment to take some questions. Yes?
Between Passover and Shavuot, is there a practice that the Jews observe?
Yes.
What do they do while they're counting the Omer?
So it's so we count the Omer during services. So we have, it's a little piece that it just tells you, today, so-and-so, here we are, it's day, 25 of the Omer. So we just kind of do that as an addition to our service. This is an interesting time. It's a time where there's a lot of contemplation and a desire to actually, you are supposed to not get married in that time. You're supposed to be serious and almost a time of sort of deep perspective, and you're not supposed to celebrate. Well, what's interesting in that is that on the 33rd day of the Omer, Rabbi Akiva, a very famous rabbi, right, was let out of jail. He was taken into jail by the Romans and ultimately killed by the Romans for studying Torah, for just being a Jew, right? So, or being an Israelite. I mean, at that point, they were Jews. But Rabbi Akiva was let out of jail, and so that's a day of celebration. So people can get married on the 33rd day of the Omer, and in Israel, it's like wedding central. Wedding central, because, now it's getting nice, and it's not getting too hot, and people want to get married. So every single place has a wedding on the 33rd day of the Omer. There's a differing of opinion, so some groups say from the 33rd day on, you can get married. So that's easier. There are some groups that say only on the 33rd day, and then you go back. And you're not supposed to cut your hair. You're not supposed to shave. It's like a little mini time of mourning because, basically because of what happened during the Roman Empire or the Roman occupation. But for the most part, it's a very serious time. What happens also during that time is that new traditions have been added. So when the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 happened, they thought to themselves, how are we going to commemorate two major historic times? The Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel. How are we going to do that? So the Knesset, it's interesting because over here in the month of Av, the 9th of Av, which is in the summer, is called Tisha B'Av. Tisha is 9. Viv in Av, the month of Av. The 9th of Av, every bad thing that ever happened to the Jewish community happened on that date. So the destruction of the first temple that I talked about, you guys know a lot of history that even Jews know. The destruction of the first temple. Guess what date it happened on? The 9th of Av. The second destruction of the temple. What time did it happen on? The 9th of Av. What happened? A historic event that happened in the Holocaust on the 9th of Av. So people said, we should, and this is a day of fasting, Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, they said, you know what? We should commemorate the Holocaust in line of all the other disasters that have happened to the Jewish people. And we should do it on the 9th of Av. And the majority of the opinion of the Knesset at the time said, you know what, no.